Hey yo, two-wheel friends, Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider. Our guest today is BMW's F900 GS. That is a tall, mean, and serious machine. It weighs almost 500 pounds, makes 100 horsepower, and costs $18,000. To put it broadly, it is the latest and also the largest of BMW's midsize adventure offerings, and it has become more pointed and purposeful than ever. So on the ride to work today, we will talk a little bit about the history of the midsize GS and also where BMW is aiming with this bike and whether or not it hit the mark. Lots to talk about, everybody. Let's get going.
Here we go, everybody. Before we get started, a quick reminder that May was Motorcycle Safety Awareness Month. And while you might not be watching this video, in the month of May, RevZilla always wants you to ride safe, which is why this May we launched the Airbag Save campaign at RevZilla.com/airbags. So to learn all about the latest innovations in rider safety technology, you can click on the link in the description of this video. In the meantime, thanks for watching and ride safe. Alrighty then, here we go. BMW's F900 GS, it's all dirty because I tested it thoroughly. You're welcome. I even got some vegetation jammed in here by the radiator cap. Anyway, okay, stay focused, Zach. Here we go. We will start at the engine, which is a 270-degree firing order parallel twin, as is all the rage in the motorcycling world these days. It is 895 cc's in displacement, and it's a fairly standard engine really in this sort of day and age as far as structure and build. We'll talk a little bit more about output and how it feels when we ride. Other structure of the bike, you got this cast twin spar frame that kind of wraps around the cylinders and grabs them from the side, and a steel trellis subframe that bolts on at the back of the engine and the back of the frame. As is typical with adventure bikes, the exhaust tries its best not to go completely underneath the engine, so you'll see the pipes kind of come out the front and then they go off to the side next to the bottom of the engine and run back to this big old bread box, which has to do with emissions of one kind or another, and then back to a standard Akrapovic BMW muffler there, which is supposedly a performance upgrade of some kind, but anyway, it looks sharp. I like the carbon fiber end cone there. Aside from that, this GS has the upgraded suspension, so it has a Zack shock, which has compression and rebound damping control, as well as hydraulic preload with the knob over yonder here. And then the upgraded fork with slightly stiffer stanchions and more rigidity and a little bit wider control of damping adjustment in the front suspension. And of course, as any self-respecting smaller mid-size adventure bike has, a 21-inch front wheel. You can see these are cross-spoke tubeless rims, which is standard, I would say, for a premium product in this class. So yeah, you sort of got upgraded suspension. You got some nice features like the tubeless wheels, and you got this this new shape of the bike, new engine in the F900 as upgraded from the F850, and yeah, new look, new headlight, new face, new windscreen, new bodywork, kind of a new feel to the bike, as we'll talk about as we ride. As per usual, I will ask you to take note of the shape of the seat right here. We'll talk about passenger accommodations a little bit later on. Another thing that I'll point out about passenger accommodations while we're here in the parking lot is, let me see if I can get the right angle here, but do you see how much wider the passenger foot pegs are than the rider foot pegs? The rider foot pegs are pretty far in toward the center of the bike. The passenger foot pegs are set pretty wide on account of the pipe on the right side, but it's also matched on the left side here. I guess it's not a huge deal one way or the other. I just think it's kind of interesting, and it is noticeable when you sit in the passenger seat. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. What else do we talk about? Well, for now in the parking lot here, I don't know. Quick shifter here, and yeah, adjustable lever here for height, obviously, as basically any bike has. But then you know, this little thing rotates with this little torque screw here, and the brake lever has what's kind of standard on premium adventure bikes, which is this sort of hinging foot pedal for the rear brake, which allows you to change the height real easy like, which is kind of keen. All right, so let's fire it up here. It's a 6.5-inch TFT screen. It is a sort of standard issue for BMWs. You can see it has GPS mount on it here, though there's no GPS, but BMW often sort of suggests that the GPS is mounted there both for customers and for members of the media. It's kind of a nice place to mount it up nice and high like that. But at any rate, let's fire this bad boy up. Sound like a 270 degree firing order, parallel twin. Well, it should, because it is. All right, kids, I think we're ready. One more thing you can take note of is the tires. These are Metzler Crew 4, maybe? Yeah, Crew 4s, I think. And they are quite knobbly and burly and not really the best tire to ride to work on. We'll talk more about that as we get going, but I'm just taking note of that we're not going to see much of once we're riding. All right, F900 GS. All right, kids, let's talk about specs. And if you know Daily Rider, you know that I love talking about seat height when we're at a red light. The seat height on the F900 GS is 34.3 inches. I will show you how much bend I have in my leg, which is not very much. It is a tall motorcycle. It feels tall. And I think it feels pretty heavy coming off the kickstand. It tipped the scales at, 495, 491, something like that. Almost 500 pounds with a full tank of 3.8 gallons. And it feels like a big bike. I'm not going to say it feels heavy in a way that's like not expected for a bike that weighs 500 pounds, but it feels full size, no question about it. And if you're thinking 3.8 gallons, wait a second, that's like about as much as an MT-09 has. How come an adventure bike doesn't have a bigger tank? Well, you just bear with me, everybody. We'll talk about that in a minute. The new 895cc engine claims 105 horsepower, I do believe, and 60 something foot-pounds of torque or something. All the specs are listed in the description of this video, of course. And the MSRP for the bike as tested, I believe, is $18,390, $18,400, something like that. But as usual with BMWs, pricing is a little bit of a slippery fish to try to hold on to. The pricing packages vary a lot and depends where you live in the world, and it depends sometimes which bikes are stocked in dealers and so on and so forth. And at this point, I will point you to, again, the description of this video, where there's a link to the article that my lovely colleague Spurgeon Dunbar wrote about this motorcycle, which includes a full breakdown of pricing and, of course, a more in-depth look at specifications. Okay, now we can talk about what the bike feels like to sit on. I mentioned that the seat feels high, and that is true. The foot pegs are a little bit lower on this bike, actually, than they were on the F850 GS. I suppose you could convince me that it feels that way. There's plenty of legroom, as there should be for any bike that has a 34-inch seat height or something, or any adventure bike, really, and especially one that has a tallish seat height. You want there to be plenty of legroom, and I would say that there is. It's also an especially relaxed and upright riding position, in part because this trophy colorway GS that we got for our tester has these bar risers on it. Can you see these little, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but there are bar risers on this bike, so the actual showroom spec of a bike without risers would have handlebars that are probably, what is that, about an inch lower, maybe a little less than an inch lower than the bike that I am riding. Either way, it is an exceptionally neutral and pleasant rider triangle, as you would expect from a bike in this category. As I merge onto this extremely slow-moving freeway, I'll just put in a quick note for any and all motorcycles in this approximate category that have very upright and neutral riding positions, because this is exactly where it's so useful. I'm doing a lot of checking over my shoulder to make sure there's no traffic. And when you're on a sport bike all hunched over, it's hard to see over your shoulders, no two ways about it. These are like little slivers of fabric and texture that come to mind when I'm rating a motorcycle on the Daily Rider leaderboard. Everyone says, oh, adventure bikes, so it's like obviously so obvious that adventure bike can be the top of the category. But you know, they're practical. And when you're getting around town or riding to work, practicality is paramount, you might say. Well, look at us go here. We're going 65 miles an hour, just like that. And the F900 GS is, I think, really, really good at 65 miles an hour. The engine is remarkably smooth. There's like sort of a nice pulse that comes through the handlebar and the foot pegs. I think it's really, really agreeable. The mirrors are good at this speed. However, I don't think 65 miles an hour is really the true test for touring chops on a motorcycle anymore. I think you should be able to go 75 or 80 pretty comfortably. And with that said, the F900 GS has absolutely enough horsepower and smoothness from the engine to go 75 or 80 miles an hour all day long. But what happens is the mirrors go blurry, the vibes get a little bit worse, and it's nothing that I think is worth like totally condemning the bike for. But when I think about it, my expectations are high for a motorcycle that's nearly 1,000 cc's and nearly $20,000, regardless of where it fits into its own model line or family lineup, whatever. Two more notes that I will provide about the F900 GS in this context. One is that the windshield, which when I first saw pictures of it, I thought, come on, they're just like trying to make it look like a Dakar rally bike, and it's not actually practical, or it's not going to do anything. It has that like lip that faces forward at the front here, and I thought that's kind of silly, but it actually works really well. I think it's like the air that comes off it, even though it's far away from my chin, it's very, very little buffeting, even at high speeds. It's sort of not minimalist, but minimal wind protection for a bike in this category. It pulls air away from your chest, it leaves your arms, your shoulders, and your head out in the wind. But I'm kind of okay with that. This bike's supposed to be kind of rugged, and I don't think it's supposed to coddle the rider in that way. So I'm a fan of the windscreen. I think they did a good job, and I do think it looks cool, ultimately. The other note I'll make about highway manners on the F900 GS is the seat, which sort of feels like a regular old seat when you first sit on it. For me, after a couple hours in the saddle, I really did not like it at all. I'm not sure if I'm sinking through the foam, like it's too soft, but I just was really uncomfortable. It didn't work for me. My buddy Spurge here wrote the First Ride article on this motorcycle, attended the launch in Utah, United States. He rode the bike from Utah back to Los Angeles here to give me the motorcycle to test for Daily Rider, and I asked him how he liked the seat after spending hundreds and hundreds of miles in the saddle, and he said that's fine. He didn't have any problem with it at all. So I suppose general PSA that all of our buns are shaped a little bit differently. I don't like this seat at all. I found it to be surprisingly uncomfortable considering the makeup of the machine and the company that it comes from. One piece of good news if you don't like the seat is that 3.8 gallons of gas is a small amount of gasoline for an adventure touring motorcycle. Fuel averages were around 44, 42, something like that, low 40s I believe, for all the tanks that we tested, and that means the fuel light, the sort of like warning light, comes on with 50 miles of reserve at 110 miles or something like that, 120 miles sometimes, which is really soon for a bike like this. And ultimately, even though I ran the range down to practically zero on a couple of occasions, I got 150 miles out of a tank. That's 150. So is that enough to get around? And like, sure, are you gonna find a gas station every 150 miles? Probably. And you could probably squeeze 170, 175 if you're gentle with the throttle, riding a little bit slower, or you push your reserve light a little bit longer. But for me, anything less than 200 miles for a big, like a full-size adventure bike like this is a little disappointing. 150 miles of range is a lot less than 200. I find it surprising, especially considering the F850 GS, this bike's predecessor, also had that issue. It just didn't have a lot of range, and to me that was such a strange and obvious mistake to make, and yet this bike has an even smaller tank, I believe, than the F850. So, you know, again, it's subjective. I think it's silly to have this little fuel on the bike, but maybe you don't feel like you need to go more than 150 miles. Or maybe, I should point out, you're planning to get the F900 GS Adventure, which has a 6-gallon tank and of course will have much longer legs on the freeway. And I know I already complained about the mirrors at 80 miles an hour, but we could do a little practical test here. So it's pulling like 5,200, 5,300 RPM at 80 miles an hour in 60 years, so we'll go to 5,200, and yeah, it's just really buzzy. It's buzzy. It feels it's got like electricity run through the mirror at this RPM, which is not a huge deal. It's just surprising. All right, we're ducked into our little neighborhood here. for the Round Town Challenge and our Footless Stop Challenge. And I haven't done a lot of this on this bike. I feel like, nope, that one didn't work. I feel like in general the controls are quite communicative and good. The clutch feels pretty good, I think. Throttle response is good. The brakes are sharp, just like most BMWs. The couple of complaints I have for manners in this realm, one is it's tall, right? It's a tall bike with the gas up high, and I think it feels sort of predictably top heavy for a bike of this size and stature. Let me get a full stop here. Oh, no, I gotta wait too long for these people. The other thing is that the transmission is not my favorite. I have found the quick shifter, both up and down, to be practically flawless. I have not missed a shift. I found it to be really agreeable and smooth, and I think it's extremely well engineered. I just can't really tell what's going on. I had the same complaint about the M1000 Single R that we covered on Daily Rider. And when I ride certain bikes, I'm thinking mostly of, I think, there we go, there's a footless stop. I'm thinking mostly of Yamahas and KTMs. I just feel like I can feel when I shift gears, I can feel what the transmission's doing. I'm like, oh yeah, I know where we are. I know what's happening. I'm getting a memo. Whereas BMW transmissions are surprisingly kind of numb, though they work really well. So that's something I would prepare yourself for, especially in this environ. All right, 2 footless stops, though. That's pretty good. Another interesting thing to point out, I think, about the transmission that Spurgeon mentioned in his article is that he does not think you can turn off the quick shifter, which maybe we'll try and dig for that when we do our dash, our sort of dash run through later on. But that is kind of rare. Usually when there's a quick shifter option, you can at least go in and shut it off. He likes to have the quick shifter off, especially while riding off-road, and it does not appear that that's an option on the F900 GS for whatever that's worth. So ultimately, the review of the, hey, Corvette guy. Is that Corvette guy himself? Working on his Corvettes. Nice. Nice. So ultimately, the Round Town review of the F900 GS, I think, is that it's kind of like, you know, like a big Jeep Wrangler you see moseying around the city with, you know, 30 whatever inch mud tires on it. And you think, what are you doing with that vehicle in the, like, what are you doing? It's not that it doesn't work. You can drive around, it's fine, but it's built to tolerate so much more than this environment. And ultimately you're sacrificing some practicality and usability of a vehicle that would be good around the city to have the look, feel, and capability of an off-road machine. So it's perfectly agreeable, but I wouldn't say it's happy in this environment. Dynamite footless stop though. Nice. You love to see it. Okay, Lover's Lane will set the old cruise control, and we can hop back on the passenger seat for just a moment here. And what I will tell you is that those foot pegs are set really wide. And it's not that that's a problem, because ultimately when you're sitting behind a rider, you're going to want your knees to be apart anyway, so that there's room to wrap around the person ahead of you. But it is kind of a small perch and not designed necessarily for the long haul, though if you had a top case on the back, some saddlebags for support, and a grab rail, of which there is very little right now, it would be probably an agreeable place to sit from a general comfort standpoint. However, I don't think this bike is really pointed in that direction, right? The person who wants this bike, as far as BMW is concerned, I'm reading between the lines here, is someone who wants to ride solo. They want to be aggressive and ambitious and off-roady in their endeavors, and cruising down the highway for mile after mile with a passenger on the back is less likely to be the brief for this particular, especially the spec of F900 GS. Be more like F900 GS Adventure with the big tank and a top case. That's more your cruising touring bike there. Right, we're tucking into the twisty road section here, and the big caveat with this bike in this review is that I have those knobby tires on, and it definitely robs some feel and some kind of like I don't know if confidence is the right word, but like overall capability, right? Like those tires are not designed to do this kind of thing. I would really hesitate to comment fully on what the bike feels like on street tires, but I feel quite confident in saying that it's gonna work pretty well, and I have a couple reasons for that. One, bikes like this often work pretty well for twisty roads. BMW has a good history of making their bikes handle well on twisty roads, and the up-spec suspension on this F900 I think is 9 inches of travel in the fork and 8.5 in the shock, so there's a lot of suspension stroke there, which means if you're hustling through curves and stabbing the brakes, you're going to get fork dive, but you're more liable to be able to control it in a way that makes you happy with fully adjustable suspension available. And I suspect with some 80/20 sport touring adventure tires on this bike, it would carve up a twisty road all day long and be an absolute hoot doing it, because it's pretty fun even on knobbies. Right, out onto surface streets, here we go. Engine's very strong, and it's very linear. I appreciate that. It's better than the F850 engine, in my opinion, which always just felt kind of tinny and thin, and there are sort of remnants of that in the 900 engine. It's got a very light flywheel, and it sometimes feels a little flighty and synthetically energetic, if that makes sense. What I'm reaching for here is I really struggle to criticize it too much, because I just think it's so good. I mean, it just works really well. It has nice broad power. It's smooth down low in the revs, and it like produces plenty of power to have fun and get where you need to go, more than enough power for anything you want to do off-road. It's a really good engine. I think what I struggle with is the lineage, which, to go back to the F800 GS, which came out in 2008, maybe 15 or so years ago, and it had a 360-degree firing order, which means the two pistons inside the engine there went up and down together next to each other, and it sort of mimicked the noise of the BMW's Boxer, flat twins. And I always kind of liked that. I thought it was charming and weird. It was unique. Weren't really other bikes that were doing it. And I think moving away from that and having the engines built in China now instead of in Thailand, maybe, or somewhere, I think it was Rotax that was building those engines. I'm not 100% sure. My history's getting flimsy here. The point is, the F800 engine felt like a sort of uniquely BMW thing, and I appreciated that about it. And eventually that F800 model got big and heavy, and there was an adventure that was 500 some pounds, and the engine felt a little bit strained in those environs and in that bike. So you can't blame BMW for moving forward, and you can't blame BMW for reaching for the sort of en vogue 270 crank firing order, because it makes a cool sound and everyone seems to like the power delivery, and so on and so forth. Even though it's better, this engine is better than an F800 engine, absolutely, I struggle to love it quite as much or feel the charm. I don't think it has as much kind of familial feel and charm, for what it's worth. That kind of stuff is a joke for the suspension. Eats it for breakfast. So anyway, I guess that whole discussion around the engine is a good pivot into this section, where we sometimes say, is the bike worth buying just for the engine alone? And in this case, no, I don't think so. This engine doesn't do more for me than a Honda Africa Twin or a Transalp. I think it's stronger than a Yamaha Tenere 700 engine or an Aprilia Touareg 660 engine. Sort of stronger both numbers wise and the way that it holds itself, but it doesn't stand out for me. It's good, but it's hard to say that it's notable or anything. All right, we got a red light. We can talk about the thin film transistor, or TFT dash, which we don't really need to spend a ton of time on, because if you watch any other BMW review I've ever done, basically this is the same dash. You have this click wheel here to navigate some things. You have this menu button, so if you click down on this menu, we'll go down into my vehicle, and at this point you can click through your onboard computers and that type of thing, which has lots of information. If you go way on over here, you go to settings, and here's where you can click through at the wheel and access vehicle settings, system settings, this kind of thing. We can look for the quick shifter. Let's see here. Vehicle settings. Oh, we don't have time. We're not gonna. No, okay. Anyway, it is a vast and deep, I guess, dash, and now it's telling me that settings are only operable when halted. Cool, then give me the other information. Go back. Whatever. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so it's a complex dash to navigate, but it does have a lot of information and a lot of data. And to BMW's credit, I'm used to it now, and I kind of like the look of it. It's got a real rich, kind of deep, crisp colors, and I like the matte bezel around it. It sort of makes it feel high quality. It's good in general. Okay, so let's circle back to what I said in the beginning about this bike being more pointed and purposeful than ever. And what did I mean by that? And who is this bike aimed at? Well, when Spurgeon attended the launch of this bike, BMW presented a graph of how much market share Triumph and KTM have in the midsize adventure market, according to some data or another. And it's a lot. Triumph and KTM have done a lot of work to capture market share in the midsize ADV category with the Tiger 900 and the 890 Adventure R, and BMW's definitely after that, and that's the way this bike feels, especially this sort of full zoot, you know, up-spec suspension version of the F900. It feels like it's trying to be more rugged, more off-road oriented, more ready for, you know, the aggressive off-road rider, and I appreciate that. We can talk a little bit more later about what the trials and tribulations of that move make for BMW, but for now I will say I think that it's definitely a stride in that direction, and I think that that's arguably the right call, right? People like the idea of a quote-unquote mid-size ADV being gnarly and rugged and ready to be a sort of serious off-road machine. So yeah, respect. And on that topic, we can now test the off-road ability. Oh, and now that we've got our adventure bike, there's no more puddles. Looks like there's some mud though. We probably have some fun over there. Okay, so we're in road mode here. I didn't even talk about ride modes. There are 5 ride modes, I believe: Rain, Road, Dynamic, Enduro, and Enduro Pro on this up-spec GS here. Enduro Pro has the least intrusive traction control and ABS settings. I believe ABS is off in the rear wheel in Enduro Pro. So I guess let's start with Enduro, maybe, which is sort of like lessened traction control, but still ABS on both wheels, I believe. Let's try it. See what this bad Melberg is ready for. Oh yeah, it softens the throttle response a lot as well. Yeah, and front ABS is pretty aggressive still. Oh, these ruts are good gnarly. All right, I'm going to go to Enduro Pro, and we're going to wander into this muck here. Whoa! Whoa! Big slides. This thing is a riot in this mode. Front ABS is still quite active, but rear ABS is much less so. Lets you get a lot of wheel spin, even with the Enduro traction control on. And you can turn TC off if you want to, and I did eventually, but you don't really need to. You can jump it, you can slam it into things. It's surprisingly good at that kind of thing, and it kind of redeemed the things about it that I don't like as a street bike, to be honest. There are some things I didn't like, but it's really potent enough doing that kind of thing that it's hard to dislike. The one thing I will note before we move on is that Spurge mentioned this in his article, but there were a lot of flat tires due to the rims bending on the launch of this bike, and he sort of found it to be a bit of a chink in the armor for this bike. I rode it off-road, and I felt like I slammed it into some stuff pretty aggressively. In fact, I hit a couple rocks that I did not mean to at fairly high speed, and everything was fine. My experience did not show that the wheels were particularly soft or that that was a problem, but Spurgeon's did. So I feel compelled to mention that because it's worth looking into if you really want to get aggressive with this machine. So I'm going to go back to road mode, but then we're going to turn traction control off here with this button, which is so handy and slick and smooth and fast. I love the way the BMW does that. All right. Okie doke, back out on the straight and narrow, and we can see if this sucker will do a wheelie, which it absolutely will, because it makes 100 horsepower. Why would it not? You can do great wheelies on it. Smooth, linear throttle response and 100 ponies on tap. Wheelie to your heart's content, I would say. In order to test the ability to back it in, we can go back to Enduro Pro, close the throttle. We are in Enduro Pro mode. Good stuff. And then, yeah, you can torture these knobbies practically all day long. I do like the adjustability in electronics. You can go into modes that have rear ABS off on the fly. You can shut off traction control on the fly. It's the type of control that I would want to have if I paid 20 grand for a bike. Woohoo! Sliding around now. These knobbies on pavement are sketchy. Not a good setup for the U-turn challenge, sadly. We only have one space. This bike's got pretty good turning radius, but not good enough to do it in one space, by gosh. It's tall and long after all. All right, we're going here. We're gonna go full lock left, feet up. What do we think? What do we think? I think that's less than 2. That's pretty good for a bike with a wheelbase like this and suspension travel like this. It's got pretty good steering sweep, and you want that, you know? You're navigating tight trails or doing a U-turn on a dirt road, which, you know, frankly, hopefully you will do if you have this bike, then you're gonna want that. All right. And it's even muddier than it was. And for once, I'm proud of that. That's the way it should be. Nice little piece of engineering here. This little flap that comes down, as any self-respecting adventure bike should have, because all that mud that got caked and splattered and stuck underneath the fender, very little of it is on the shock spring and shock body. Just a little note there. Pretty basic piece of adventure engineering, but you'll have to see it. All right, let's listen to this engine one more time. It's rowdy, right? It's pretty rowdy. It's definitely, yeah, it's a little bit burlier, and it feels like it carries a little more weight and has a little more presence than the 850 engine, in my opinion. It just doesn't feel like as much like a BMW, you know? It feels like it's reaching to be one of its competitors more than itself. It's good, but yeah, I've already said my piece. So enough about what I have to say, right? Let's see what you have to say. And that's actually, to talk about the engine is a good segue to this first question here from Joel Abum Stutz, who says, I know you said the engine in the last gen 850, 750s was wispy and not joy-inducing. Have they spunked it up, or is it still beige? I just talked about your question, right? Yeah, it's better. It's spunk. It's got spunk and it's better and stuff. It's just like, maybe it isn't BMW in a way that I want it to be. But maybe that's just me. So, you know. Next question is from Kyle Cuviello, who says, how did Yamaha and KTM make this size of bike seem like a really cool choice, yet the BMW always seems like you couldn't afford the big one? Is this one good enough to change that from previous generations? Such an interesting question. I think this is a really astute observation about sort of like culture, right? Like, why is it that one brand seems to be like, oh, that's the one I would want, while there's another brand you're like, nah, it's not the other one, it's not the real one, you know? I will say, I think the aggressive nature of this bike, the you know, sort of like making it long and tall and mean and more aggressive, especially in this iteration that we have here to test, is a good idea to separate it from the big GS. I do think that is something that was probably discussed in a BMW boardroom at some point, or an engineering room at the very least, and it's the right call, because if you're going to try to make a touring bike that has some off-road ability, you're always going to be staring down the barrel of the big GS, especially if you do it in the BMW lineup. So this does separate itself more from the big bike. Whether or not it's cool now, I don't know. It depends what you want. I do think that was a good move on BMW's part and makes the spread of offering wider in that family of bikes. Great question. Really like that. Next question is from 903 Liu, who says, this, a Yamaha Tenere 700 or an Aprilia Touareg 660, which is better for what application? The big thing that this bike does that those bikes do not is to have a premium feel and sort of brief. The big dash, the high-end suspension, the cruise control, the switchable electronics, the heated grips. It's an elevated product. It's an upper crust compared to those bikes. And that's not necessarily good or bad, but it is notable. It is a serious and notable upgrade from those bikes from the standpoint of equipment, not just horsepower. And that sort of relates to this next question from Moto50, who says, how does this truly stand out in the middleweight adventure crowd? And this is where I think, I mentioned this earlier, this is where I think the F900 GS struggles a little bit. Because if you really want an off-road weapon and you're willing to spend the better part of 20 grand, like Spurgeon's got that KTM 890 Adventure R Rally, which is more expensive than this bike, I believe, but it's particularly pointed and rowdy and wild and raw and tall, and the suspension is even better, I think, on that bike than it is on this bike. And so that feels like if you really want that weapon, that's where you would go. If you don't want to spend all the money on the KTM, you think, like, well, I just want something that's like a little bit less gnarly, but I want that look and that feel, then it does feel like an Aprilia Tuareg 660 is kind of what you're looking at, right? Like it's got plenty of power to be a touring bike. It's got cruise control. It's got switchable electronics. It's got some of the stuff, and the suspension's not bad out of the box, and it's so much cheaper. I don't remember how much that bike is. Isn't it like 12 grand? We'll put it on screen maybe. I don't remember how much, what the MSRP is of a Tuareg 660, but it's so much less than a KTM Adventure R Rally or this bike. And, you know, not to mention a Honda Transalp or a Yamaha T7, which are $10,000, $11,000. So if you're reaching up for capability, it does feel like there's another option that might be a little bit better. And if you're reaching down, then it feels like there might be options that are a little bit better. And, you know, this combination of specifications and feel and the look and the options is unique to BMW. I don't know how to answer this question in a way that BMW would be happy with. How does it stand out? I don't know. I think it's a good bike, but I don't know how it stands out. If you have your own opinions, feel free to chime in the comments. Maybe I missed something. Okay, last question here. We're going to do a fun one, as I always try to do. This is from Astsaft, who says, if this bike would be a food for a long hike in the wild, what would it be? Right, so you're going out in the woods, and you take some food with you. What food would it be? I thought about this for a while. It's a great question. Love it, first of all. Difficult to answer. Here's what I came up with. I think it's like a really woody and healthy trail mix. You know, like it's one of those trail mixes, like there's not a lot of chocolate or sweets in there. You know, it's like dried fruit, it's sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds and walnuts and almonds and all stuff that's good for you and will keep you satisfied when you're out in the woods. But if you came back to the city, you came back to civilization and you're, you know, sitting at your desk or sitting in the movies and you were eating that, people might be like, why do you have that here? What are you doing with that? And that's a little bit of a harsh distillation of the F900 to suggest that it's no good to be used around town. Of course, it works fine. But I think that's what this is. It's a fairly committed hiking meal. You're going to want to be, and you probably will be, pretty serious about your hike if you're taking that out on the trail, because it's not like the chocolate and peanut trail mix. We're talking about the real, you know, the stuff your weird uncle likes. So that's my answer. I love that question, of course. Thank you all for all your questions and comments and interest. Stick with me, everybody. We're going to put the sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard.
Okay, everybody. Here we are inside RevZilla West. We are at the Daily Rider leaderboard. We have a BMW F900 GS ready to go up here. Friendly reminder of what's at the top there. You got the KTM 890 SMT, Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello, and BMW M1000 Single R on the podium. I did mention in the ride, I think, something about how, you know, ADV bikes are often near the top of the leaderboard just because, like, they just kind of work well. I also mentioned on this ride that the F900 is kind of like pointed and aggressive enough that it's maybe not the best riding around town. You know, ultimately, it is a really, really good bike. I pulled it into the shop. I'm looking at it. All right, let's talk about how to break it down here. Triumph Scrambler 1200X. The F900 is going to be higher up than the Triumph Scrambler 1200X because of its touring chops. And it's just sort of like usability. Like, can you ride across the continent on the Scrambler 1200X? Absolutely. But you'd be better off on an F900. Z900 SE. So solid, such a solid bike. I would almost be sooner to recommend a Z900 than an F900 because
it's lower and more approachable and it's kind of easier in a lot of ways. But ultimately, the capability and versatility of the F900, I think, does make it a better bike. Now, is it better than an M1000R? It's more versatile, I think. You know, it's probably a better touring bike than an M1000R. And it's obviously a better off-road bike, clearly. But the M1000 is like awfully comfortable and refined for riding around town. For a daily ride, you might say. Is an F900 better than a V100 Mandello? In a lot of ways it is. It's more versatile. It's got good touring chops, as the V100 does. I just think the V100 just like will fill your ride with so much more interest and charisma and emotive power, and the engine is delicious. I just want to slice it up and put it on toast. It's so good. I don't think I can give the F900 GS the nod over the V100 Mandello. I don't think I can do it. It's going to go just off the podium on the Daily Rider leaderboard, below the M1000 single R from the same manufacturer. I think the F900 GS, if you wanted that bike instead of an M1000 single R, I wouldn't blame you. You know, the M1000 is an awfully heavy hammer to swing around on a normal daily ride. I just think the refinement of the M1000 was so good. It was just so pleasant and easy and precise. I just think the little stuff on the M1000 is better. Perhaps an F900 GS base model with a lower seat, with street tires, perhaps the GS Adventure. Maybe that's the bike that I would prefer to ride because it has better fuel range and would be a little bit more approachable and more ready to ride on the road. So maybe the dirt bikey version bit it just a little bit, but I think that's fair. I think it's fair. I think it being pointed has bumped it down the leaderboard a little bit, though I very much appreciate, as I said, that aspect of the bike and those characteristics that BMW added. All right, there you have it. The two BMWs are right next to each other on the Daily Rider leaderboard. I think I've done all I can do for you today. Thank you so much for hanging out. Please ride safe. I'll see you next time.
Oh, that's really rocky. Into this road, I guess.